Miami, 1985. A city drowning in cocaine, cash, and blood. When 3 bodies were found floating in the dark, murky waters of the Miami River, the Miami Police Department immediately wrote it off as just another cartel turf war, a drug deal gone wrong. Thugs, taking out thugs. Case closed. But the men who orchestrated this brutal midnight slaughter weren't cartel hitmen. They were the very people sworn to protect the city. Federal indictments, wiretaps, and a mountain of stolen cocaine would soon prove that a massive syndicate of active-duty, uniformed police officers were operating as a heavily armed, bloodthirsty drug cartel. Today, we are dismantling the Miami River Cop scandal. We will uncover how the police department knowingly hired literal criminals, how these officers turned their badges into licenses to kill, and how a corrupt justice system desperately tried to sweep the ultimate betrayal under the rug. The night of the 28th of July 1985 was suffocatingly humid. Down at the Jones Boat Yard on the edge of the Miami River, a smuggling operation was quietly taking place. A boat named the Mary C had docked, carrying roughly 400 kilograms of pure cocaine hidden inside its hull. The men unloading it were criminals. They were smugglers. But what happened to them that night was not justice. It was an execution. Suddenly, the darkness of the boatyard was shattered by the harsh glare of flashlights and the authoritative shouts of men in uniform. "Police! Freeze! Hands where we can see them!" For a smuggler, getting busted by the cops is an occupational hazard. You put your hands up, you take the arrest, you call your lawyer. But as the smugglers surrendered, they quickly realized these officers were not there to read them their Miranda rights. These officers were there to take the cocaine, and they were leaving no witnesses. The uniformed men aggressively corralled the smugglers at gunpoint. Panic set in. The officers ordered the men toward the edge of the dock. The sheer terror of realizing that the people wearing the badge the people society tells you to trust are actually a death squad is a psychological nightmare that is difficult to fathom. Fearing for their lives, several men jumped into the pitch-black, fast-moving waters of the Miami River. Others were forced in at gunpoint. The police officers didn't try to save them. They didn't call for backup. They simply watched as the men struggled in the treacherous currents, hauling millions of dollars worth of cocaine into their police cruisers, while 3 men, Jacobo Garcia, Luis Delgado, and Mario Ramirez, drowned in the dark. When morning broke and the bloated bodies were pulled from the river, the official homicide investigation began. Homicide detectives arrived at the boatyard. They saw the abandoned vehicles. They saw the signs of a massive ripoff. And almost immediately, a witness came forward. A security guard in the area told investigators a chilling detail. The men who raided the boatyard were wearing Miami Police Department uniforms. They had police radios. They drove what looked like unmarked police vehicles. This should have been the moment the department locked down its ranks and launched a massive internal probe. Instead, the higher-ups scoffed. The official narrative was swiftly pushed to the media. Imposters. The police department assured the public that ruthless cartels were simply buying fake police uniforms from costume shops to rip each other off. It was a convenient lie. It protected the department's image, and more importantly, it kept the public blindly trusting the uniform. But behind closed doors, the Miami Police Department knew they had a catastrophic problem. They were just too arrogant and too terrified of the PR nightmare to admit it. To understand how a major American police department becomes a criminal syndicate, we have to look at the catastrophic, systemic failures that occurred years before the murders. In the early 1980s, Miami was losing the drug war badly. The murder rate was skyrocketing. At the same time, the Mariel boat lift brought thousands of refugees to the city, rapidly expanding the population. The police department was vastly understaffed, demoralized, and desperate. So, city officials made a fatal, unforgivable decision. They lowered the standards. To push hundreds of new recruits onto the streets as fast as possible, the Miami Police Department essentially abandoned basic background checks. They gutted psychological evaluations. They ignored criminal records. They hired men who had admitted to drug use, men who had previously been fired from other jobs for theft, and men who completely failed the psychological screening for aggressive, sociopathic tendencies. The city handed badges, guns, and absolute authority to men who had no business being anywhere near a position of power. These new recruits hit the streets making a measly starting salary of around $25,000 a year. Yet, almost overnight, an impossible wealth began to materialize among a specific clique of officers working the midnight shift. Officers like Armando Estrada, Roman Rodriguez, and Armando Garcia, rookies with practically zero time on the force, were suddenly driving matching, custom-ordered Porsches and DeLoreans to the precinct. They were wearing solid gold Rolex watches. They were buying million-dollar speedboats and paying for luxury waterfront real estate entirely in cash. This brings us to the most infuriating aspect of this case: the sheer, blatant visibility of the corruption and the absolute refusal of the system to stop it. If a bank teller making minimum wage suddenly starts driving a Ferrari to work, the bank audits them immediately. But in the Miami Police Department, the Internal Affairs Division turned a blind eye. Supervisors watched these rookies flaunt cartel-level wealth and did absolutely nothing. Why? Because of the deeply entrenched blue wall of silence. The culture of the department dictated that you never investigate your own, you never question another cop, and you protect the badge at all costs, even if the person wearing it is a monster. By ignoring these glaring red flags, the department leadership became complicit. They allowed a cancer to metastasize. These officers realized that because of their badges, they were untouchable. They didn't just take bribes from drug dealers to look the other way. That wasn't enough for them. They realized that the easiest way to get rich was to use the power of the state to become the apex predators of the drug trade. They formed a syndicate they called the Enterprise. Their operating procedure was as brilliant as it was evil. They would use police intelligence and informants to find out when and where massive shipments of cocaine were arriving. Then, wearing their full uniforms, driving official police cruisers, and using police radios to monitor the dispatchers, they would pull over the drug mules. When a drug trafficker sees red and blue lights, they don't shoot, they pull over. The officers would approach the vehicle, hold the criminals at gunpoint, steal the cocaine, and tell the traffickers that if they ever reported it, they would be killed. And who were the traffickers going to call? The police? It was the perfect crime. The Enterprise stole thousands of kilos of cocaine, stockpiled it in stash houses, and sold it back onto the streets of Miami, pumping poison into the very communities they were being paid by taxpayers to protect. The Jones Boatyard Massacre was supposed to be just another routine ripoff for the Enterprise. But they got sloppy. The sheer volume of cocaine, 400 kilos, drew too much heat, and the 3 dead bodies in the river made it a high-profile triple homicide. Despite the department's aggressive attempts to brush the imposter theory onto the public, the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Honest detectives within the homicide unit began to piece together the truth. They found traces of the missing cocaine, traced back to known associates of Officer Armando Estrada. But even when the truth was staring the department in the face, the systemic rot protected the killers. When honest cops tried to push the investigation forward, they received anonymous death threats. Internal files went missing. The department was more concerned with containing the scandal than catching the murderers. There was a prevailing, sickening attitude among the brass that the victims were just drug dealers. They rationalized the slaughter by claiming society was better off without the victims anyway. This is the ultimate danger of a corrupt police force. When the police decide they have the authority to act as judge, jury, and executioner, the entire foundation of society crumbles. The law ceases to exist. There is only power and the abuse of it. Realizing that the local police department was too compromised, too corrupt, and too terrified to investigate its own, the FBI and the DEA finally stepped in. They took over the investigation, bypassing local authorities entirely. Federal agents began quietly squeezing the associates of the corrupt cops. They found a low-level smuggler who had survived the boatyard raid. They found informants who had helped the cops sell the stolen cocaine. The feds built a wall of evidence so high that the blue wall of silence finally began to crack. Rudy Arias, one of the corrupt officers, was the first to break. Facing life in federal prison, the reality of his situation shattered his arrogance. He agreed to wear a wire and cooperate with the FBI, recording his fellow officers as they plotted to cover up the murders and hide their millions. In late 1985, the hammer fell. Federal agents descended on the Miami Police Department, publicly arresting active duty officers in their own precincts. The sight of uniformed police officers being led away in handcuffs by federal agents sent shockwaves across the country. But if you think the arrest was the end of the injustice, you underestimate the audacity of a corrupt system. When the officers finally went to trial in 1986, the public expected swift justice. Instead, they witnessed a mockery of the judicial system. The defense attorneys for the corrupt cops relentlessly attacked the victims, painting the deceased men as cartel scum who deserved to die. They attacked the surviving witnesses, all of whom were criminals themselves, arguing to the jury that you couldn't trust the word of a drug dealer over the word of a police officer. Even in the courtroom, the arrogance of the badge persisted. The first trial ended in a spectacular mistrial. Why? Because it was later discovered that the corrupt officers had used their cartel money to successfully bribe a juror. Let that sink in. Men who were given the power to enforce the law used millions of dollars obtained through murder to buy their way out of a federal triple homicide trial. They laughed in the face of the justice system, proving once again that if you have enough money and the right connections, the rules simply do not apply to you. It took a second, heavily guarded federal trial to finally bring them down. Ultimately, dozens of officers were indicted, fired, or sent to federal prison. Armando Garcia, who had fled the country and became a fugitive, was eventually captured years later in Colombia. The ringleaders received lengthy prison sentences, but true justice was never really served. Yes, the men who forced those smugglers into the river went to prison, but the bureaucrats, the police chiefs, and the city officials who willfully lowered the hiring standards, who knowingly handed badges to criminals just to fill a quota, never faced a single day in a jail cell. They retired with their pensions intact. The internal affairs officers who watched rookies drive Porsches and did nothing were never prosecuted. The Miami River Cop scandal remains one of the darkest, most enraging chapters in American law enforcement history. It proves that a badge does not make a person inherently good. It merely amplifies who they truly are. When a system prioritizes its own survival and public image over integrity and human life, it becomes indistinguishable from the cartels it claims to be fighting. The blood of the men who drowned in the Miami River wasn't just on the hands of the officers who raided the boatyard. It was on the hands of an entire institution that built a machine of corruption, handed the keys to monsters, and then desperately tried to cover its own eyes when the slaughter began. If the Miami River Cops proved that a badge can be a license to kill, wait until you see what happens when the killer doesn't even need a badge, just $1 billion trust fund. Click the video on your screen to see the impossible accidental death of a billionaire's girlfriend, and the horrifying lengths a city went to protect its wealthiest son.